Chapter 511 Ascension. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Finally. How long had it been since he created Saint and saw the dreadful 0/200 written in her runes? A year, no less. That was how long it had taken Sunny to gather enough memories to saturate the dark embers that burned in the black depths of his shadow. What was going to happen now? The last time Saint had evolved, her transformation took a very long time. Was she going to retreat into the chrysalis of his shadow core again? Or was reaching 200 fragments completely different from what had happened to her after the killing of the Black Knight? A few moments later, Sunny received the answer. Bathed in the lightlessness of his soul sea, Saint suddenly shuddered. The darkness hiding in her body surged, and the 3 embers hidden within it, one in her chest, one in her abdomen, and the last one in her head, shined with black radiance. It was very different, but also very similar to the process he himself had gone through twice, once after the first nightmare, and once after going through the gateway in the Crimson Spire. Is he ascending to a new rank? The thought filled Sunny with a jubilant thrill. Meanwhile, Saint was in the throes of her transformation. The still waters around her were now restless, as though assaulted by invisible winds. Wisps of dancing black flame suddenly appeared around her body, and it rose above the surface of the water, becoming partially obscured. Sunny took a step back and silently watched the strange and beautiful process, his heart beating wildly. After a few minutes, it was over. The invisible winds disappeared, and so did the black flames. The water turned tranquil and still once again. Saint landed on her feet and straightened, her graceful figure brimming with new power. The glow of her ruby eyes seemed to have become brighter. Unlike the previous time, the taciturn demon had not changed outwardly. Her onyx armor was still composed of polished, stone-like metal. Sunny knew that beneath it, her skin was still smooth and white as alabaster. On the inside, though, the changes were nothing short of profound. The darkness hiding in the body of the living statue now seemed much, much deeper, and the 3 embers seemed to have become substantially larger. More than that, they appeared to be more complete, somehow. Not yet whole, but also not as broken and fragmented as they had been before. Sunny hesitated, then summoned the runes. Shadow. Marble Saint. Her name didn't change. The next string of runes, however, was vastly different. Shadow rank. Ascended. He froze. I'll be damned. Ascended, Saint was now ascended. Indeed, she had achieved a new rank, the same rank, in fact, as that of Master Jet, as well as the Black Knight, Mirror Beast, and Mordant Mimic. An ascended human was called a master, while nightmare creatures of the same rank were called fallen. Saint was now somewhere in between, a creature possessing multiple cores, but following the path of ascension as opposed to the path of corruption. Like Sunny himself. Of course, she was much more powerful than him now. Sunny was torn between being mad with joy and slightly bitter. Back when he had created Saint, she was stronger than him for a long, long time. After becoming an awakened, he had finally caught up to her, but now, she was the stronger one once more. He sighed, then looked at his demon with a wide smile. Good job, Saint. Who's going to stop us now, huh? The taciturn demon did not answer, and just tilted her head a little. Then, however, she silently raised her hand, made a fist, and lightly struck the left side of her breastplate twice. Sunny stared, not accustomed to his shadow being so chatty. Yeah. Exactly. Feeling a little awkward, he lingered for a moment, and then looked back to the runes. Saint's class, attributes, and abilities did not change. At the very end of the plane of runes, however, he was met with an unexpected surprise. What? The last string of runes read. Shadow fragments. 39/200. He stared at the number for a few moments, then rubbed his eyes. No, he wasn't mistaken. It was indeed 30.9 out of 200. Pleasantly confused, Sonny narrowed his eyes. But how does it make sense? Before Saint had consumed Kurt, the runes showed 179/200. How many fragments exactly had eating the echo given her? With a sudden suspicion, Sonny turned around and looked at the rows of silent shadows. The shadow of Kurt was gone. So, she consumed it too. He was starting to understand what had happened. Most likely, a larger share of the fragments came not from the echo, but from the shadow of its original. Kurt had been an experienced awakened, one in possession of a fully saturated core. By absorbing his shadow, Saint must have inherited a portion of all the soul fragments he had accumulated over his life, just like a human would after slaying another human. That amount was enough to bridge the gap to the next rank, and then some. Of course, since his shadow was now an ascended, she required shadow fragments of similar quality to grow 1. To 0.1. Those that came from Kurt were only awakened, though. So, in fact, the current number would have been 78 to 200, if Saint's rank had not changed. That meant that she received almost 100 shadow fragments by consuming the echo of Shadow Blade Kurt, an utterly insane number, considering that it had taken Sonny somewhere around half a year to feed her that much before. Suddenly, the regret he felt over sacrificing such a valuable echo disappeared. That's a windfall, a crazy windfall. Today, luck was truly on his side. And an ascended demon was now by his side, which instantly propelled Sonny to a completely new level of capability. Together with the newly transformed Saint, he would be able to do much more, challenge much more powerful nightmare creatures, and therefore, accelerate his own growth even further. Even better, this change could not have come at a better time. Because it was nearly time for him to return to the shipwreck island, and challenge the terrifying being that dwelled in the ancient wreck. Having an ascended shadow by his side would be of enormous help. Sonny only noticed that a wide, stupid smile appeared on his face when Master Jet returned to the underground arena. He hurriedly erased it and stood up. All done. She gave him a relaxed nod, then yawned. Yeah. We are free to go, a little paperwork, and the contribution points I promised will be yours to spend. We can grab a bite first, if you want. Sonny smiled. Oh yes, there is also the reward from the government. Now that he didn't need to spend all the contribution points on bringing Saint to full saturation as soon as possible, what else would he be able to get? Chapter 512 Unburdened. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sitting on the very edge of the sanctuary island with his feet dangling above the abyss of the sky below, Sonny was enjoying the view of the clear streams falling down into the darkness and turning into clouds of water dust. After a while, he lowered his eyes and looked at the item laying on his palm with a bit of confusion. So, that's it. This was one of the 2 memories he had exchanged for the contribution points given to him for helping Master Jet deal with Shadow Blade Kurt. It looked like a long, narrow needle forged out of black steel, with gold wire wrapped around one of its ends, sort of like an antique acupuncture needle, but much sturdier. The needle's name was Heavenly Burden, a very ironic name for a memory, here on the Chained Isles. He had just received it this morning, and this was his first opportunity to properly study the thing. Very curious, Sonny summoned the runes. Memory. Heavenly Burden. Memory rank. Awakened. Memory tier. 3. Memory type. Tool. Memory description. To be free of a burden, one has to let go of all attachments they hold in their heart. Only those who untether themselves from everything can become truly free. Sounds wonderful. At first glance, the memory wasn't too outstanding. Its rank wasn't high, and neither was its tier. With the amount of money Sonny was making, he could probably buy something like this after a week or 2 of collecting soul shards in the dream realm. But that was why contribution points were more valuable than credits. The government had access to things that were exceedingly rare or simply impossible to get on the market. Heavenly Burden was one such thing, and it was due to the enchantment the needle possessed. Memory enchantments. Unburdened. Enchantment description. Those pierced with this needle will rise to the skies. Indeed, it was a memory that could allow him to fly. Sort of. Flight enchantments were extremely rare and tremendously valued. In all honesty, Sunny had no business being able to get his hands on a memory such as this. He was already incredibly lucky to have the dark wing, which, while not capable of true flight, was pretty close to it. Usually, only masters or saints were able to purchase decent flight memories. That was why Kai was so lucky, but Master Jet pulled some string, and as the result, Sunny was currently holding the heavenly burden in his hands. Well, from what he understood about the Black Needle, calling it a decent flight memory was a bit of a stretch. Still, it was indeed capable of gifting him the ability to fly. He grimaced a little, then thrust the needle into his forearm. However, nothing happened. Well, of course it didn't. The thing failed to pierce the soft, but adamantine fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. Sunny thought for a bit, and then enhanced the heavenly burden with one of his shadows. This time, the needle went through, and buried itself in his flesh. Ouch! The pain was sharp, but not too bad. More than that, Sunny had no time to think about it, and that was because as soon as the heavenly burden pierced his skin, his body floated up. And continued doing so. Sunny was steadily rising into the sky, be it at a slow speed. It was as though he had suddenly turned into a balloon. The feeling would have been rather funny, if it wasn't so terrifying, mostly because a sudden gust of wind threw him slightly to the side, and now, there was nothing but the darkness of the sky below beneath him. Both amused and slightly tense, Sunny summoned the dark wing. He also summoned the prowling thorn, just to be on the safer side. After both memories manifested themselves, he hesitated for a moment, and then wrapped the Black Needle in his second shadow, too. Immediately, the speed with which he was rising into the air increased. Sunny allowed himself to float upward for a few moments, and then commanded the dark wing to activate. With its help, he changed the direction of his flight, and slowly moved back toward the island. Making sure that there was solid ground under him, he then dismissed the heavenly burden and smoothly glided down. Not bad. Now, he had two memories to deal with what Cassie had seen in the vision of their supposed death. One memory could only move him upward, while the other allowed him to glide in any direction except up. Together, they gave him the ability of true flight. Even if it was slow and not nearly as effective as what Kai could do, it was still flying. The point was, he was not going to fall endlessly into the sky below again, not unless he wanted to. Sunny returned to the edge of the sanctuary, sat down, and stared at one of the chains leading to a neighboring island. It was early morning, and he was waiting for someone. They're still not here. With a sigh, he looked down and summoned the second memory he received from the government. A piece of beautiful ember that looked like solidified flame appeared on his palm, inlaid in a frame made out of dull metal. He summoned the runes. Memory. Memory of fire. Memory rank. Ascended. Memory tier. Memory type. Charm. Memory description. And then, there was nothing but flame. Short and sweet. Memory enchantments. Scorching heat. Enchantment description. This charm provides the wearer with moderate resistance to fire. And that was that. With these two memories, Sunny felt more or less ready to plunge into the dark abyss below the chained isles once more, when the time came. With Dark Wing and the heavenly burden allowing him to fly, or rather, float, and the underworld armament of the mantle enhancing the protective effect of the memory of fire, his next trip to the Ebony Tower would be less perilous. Hopefully. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted. Looking at the chain, he noticed a row of black dots moving across it, far in the distance. Straining his vision, Sunny sighed. They're here. Chapter 513 War Council. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Soon, he was able to make out the silhouettes of 7 people walking across the chain. They were led by a delicate beauty in a light polished armor, her pale blonde hair dancing in the wind. Cassie walked with her eyes covered by the silver half-dot mask, her hand resting on the hilt of the quiet dancer. If Sunny didn't know that she was blind, he would have not suspected it. The fire keepers had returned from their lengthy expedition to the desecrated grove. In the end, it took them almost 2 months to find whatever they had been searching for on that remote and ghastly island. And now, it was time for Sunny to join them in the assault on the ancient shipwreck. He grimaced. After 2 months spent without returning to the real world, members of Cassie's cohort looked weathered and exhausted. They were covered in dirt and dust, and their armor bore marks of countless battles. However, these young men and women seemed to be healthy and in good mood. There was a spring to their steps, and as they got closer, Sunny could see smiles on their lips. 2 of them were carefully carrying a large box fashioned out of crude wooden boards. He assumed that it contained the thing Cassie had spent 2 months looking for. Sunny tilted his head, curious. What might it be, I wonder? Eventually, they noticed him, too. Cassie slowed down a little, and in the next moment, the fire keeper walking behind her gently touched her on the shoulder and said something. Then, he gestured toward Sunny and waved a hand. Sunny sighed and dismissed the memory of fire. Ugh, people. In the 6 months spent on the Chained Isles, he had gotten accustomed to only dealing with other awakened in small doses. Knowing that he was going to have to be in the company of relative strangers for a while and fight with them side by side did not make Sunny happy. In that regard, Mordred had been a perfect companion. He only appeared once every few days for a short while, helped Sunny with advice, and then disappeared without a trace, not asking for anything in return. If only all relationships could be so simple. Sadly, the mysterious prince was still nowhere to be found. Sunny had not heard from him ever since returning from the ivory tower, almost making him think that he had simply imagined the whole thing. The mirror shard he kept in the covetous coffer reminded him that he had not, though. Sunny forced a smile to appear on his face, and waved at the fire keepers in return. Welcome back, guys. It's good to see you. Sort of. After the fire keepers had time to clean themselves up and fill their stomachs, they gathered in a spacious room provided to them by the White Feather clan. Sunny looked around the room and sighed inwardly. Why were his own quarters so tiny? Even if his true name remained a secret, Sunny was still an SS-class awakened. Where was his preferential treatment, huh? The large wooden box was placed in a corner, and the 7 awakened gathered around a table. He hesitated a little, then joined them. Hey, Sunny. How have you been? Sunny remained silent for a few moments, then said in a neutral tone. Busy. Really busy. The young man who had asked him the question smiled. Really? What's keeping you busy? Sunny summoned his runes, and glanced at a particular string. It read. Shadow Fragments. 1936/2000. He sighed. All kinds of things. Haven't you heard? I am the most indispensable shopkeeper on the Chained Isles. By the way, if any of you want to purchase something, just let me know. Toothpaste, spices, underpants, we have it all. The fire keepers gave him strange looks, then laughed. What's so funny? That's a legitimate business, you fools. A somber expression appeared on his face. So you were really serious? We are actually planning to attack a corrupted monster in its lair. Cassie gave him a nod. Indeed. He sighed. Let me ask you this. Are you CR? However, then, Sunny fell silent without finishing the question and suddenly cleared his throat in embarrassment. The blind girl frowned. Are you all right? Sunny waved a hand. Yes, yes. Don't mind me. Oh right, you haven't been back to the real world in a couple of months. One of the fire keepers raised an eyebrow, and asked with confusion. Sure. Why is that important? Sunny looked at him with an unreadable expression. It's not. Don't worry about it. No, really. Anyway, let's get back to the corrupted monster. How much do you guys know about that thing? Cassie lingered for a few moments, then said. We know its rank and class, the general characteristics, and a few details that the White Feather clan had shared with us. Master Roan had thought the thing in the past, but only briefly. Sunny looked at her, then shook his head. Well, I don't know what he told you, but I've seen that monstrosity in action with my own 2 eyes. So let me paint you the picture. He pointed to the shipwreck island on the map, and said in a dark tone. The wreck is situated in the center of the island, and the creature itself made a nest in its main cargo hold. Don't think that you'll be safe before we reach the ship, though. Actually, its vines stretch beneath the ground throughout the whole island. He paused, and then added. Since it's a corrupted monster, most of you won't even be able to cut the vines, let alone sever them. You don't have the Dawn Shard augmenting your memories anymore, after all. However, if you do manage to cut the vines, each cut will produce a cloud of poisonous mist. There will be poison in the air whether you cut them or not, though, especially inside the wreck. There, breathing is almost impossible. With each word he said, the fire keepers grew more and more serious. However, they were still in too good of a mood. What is wrong with these idiots? Sunny cleared his throat. Oh, and by the way, there are other nightmare creatures on the island, too. Big nasty fallen beasts called sailor dolls. He hesitated, and then said. Well, if there is one good about the whole situation, it's that the creature in the wreck usually slumbers until one of its vines is disturbed. Cassie told me that it is weak to fire. So my suggestion would be to just burn the whole ship down, and the scary bastard with it. The fire keepers glanced at each other with strange expressions. Cassie remained silent for a bit, and then said awkwardly. No, we can't burn the ship. Sunny blinked a couple of times. And why, pray tell, is that? She turned her head to the large wooden box in the corner, lingered for a moment, and then answered. Because we are going to repair it. Chapter 514 Hidden Blade. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Sunny was at a loss for words. Had he even heard it right? You are going to repair the ancient, broken, monster-infected ship. Well, it made a lot of sense, actually. Cassie nodded. Yes. We are going to cleanse, repair, and make it fly again. Oh, so it was a flying ship, too. Perfect. Honestly, Sunny shouldn't have been surprised. All the clues had been there for a long time. He had already known that the ship depicted on the miraculous coins was, most likely, the very same that lay broken on the shipwreck island. The connection was pretty easy to make, considering that they looked alike, and that the coins had come from its treasury in the first place. Sunny had also asked himself the question of what a sailing ship was doing in the middle of chained isles, which had no sea and no rivers for it to sail on. The thought that it had actually been designed to fly through the skies had crossed his mind, among other things. And finally, on the coins, the ancient ship was shown as having a beautiful tree wrapped around its mast. It had also belonged to the enigmatic person called Noctis. Wasn't it too much of a coincidence, then, that Cassie had come to the sanctuary of Noctis and ventured on a long expedition to a desecrated grove? The word desecrated implied that the burned grove had been sacred once. After all, only sacred things could be desecrated. And a sacred tree sounded exactly like something capable of making a massive ship fly. Right. Sunny stared at the large wooden box with a ponderous expression. After a while, he asked. So what's in the box? Cassie walked over and gently put a hand on its lid. A sapling. We spent 2 months searching for a living root in that ghastly place. And finally, deep underground, we found the only one that remained. The wondrous tree which kept the ancient ship afloat in the sky had come from that grove, once. The sapling will grow into a new one. She sighed, and then turned to the fire keepers. Shakti and Kair were artisans back in the bright castle. Shakti is gifted with an aspect that helps plants thrive, and was Keto's apprentice. Kair is an awakened carpenter. We have more people on the way to the Chained Isles, too, to help with the reconstruction. Sunny remained silent for a while. So she had been planning to commandeer the ancient wreck for a long time. From before he had come to invite her to challenge the second nightmare with him, was it a coincidence? They were going to have to brave the sky below to get to the seed, after all, and here was Cassie, conveniently planning to claim and repair a flying ship. How much did she really know? As if hearing his thoughts, Cassie turned to him. Her face suddenly turned somber. With this ship, we might be able to cross the Hollow Mountains. At least that is our hope. The fire keepers grew quiet. After a while, the familiar girl, Shakti, said in a dark tone. We have to try, no matter what. Going there on foot is suicide. Maybe flying will be different. They were all really resolute in their desire to find Nephis, it seemed. And what about Sunny himself? Well, things were complicated. He sighed. All right, that answers the question of why you want the ship, and how you might be able to repair it. But how are we going to defeat its current tenant without using fire? No offense, guys, but I really don't think that you can handle that fight. Maybe you can hold on for a while outside the wreck, but inside, it's a death trap. The fire keepers looked at each other again. Finally, their mood turned dark. Cassie hesitated for a few moments, and then said. We are going to kill it the old-fashioned way. Use someone as bait, and strike the monster down while it's distracted. Sunny rubbed his face. Let me guess. I am the bait. The blind girl smiled, then shook her head. No. We are the bait. You are the blade that will pierce the creature's heart from the shadows. That sounded solemn and sort of grand, but she immediately ruined the moment by adding in an awkward tone. I mean, if it has a heart. If it doesn't, then, well, you know. Kill it some other way. Not exactly the icon of eloquence, are we? Sunny frowned. He did like the idea of not being the bait for once. Well, to be honest, Neph was usually the bait. Actually, this plan sort of made sense. He already knew that he could survive in the poisonous miasma inside the ship, and that with enough augmentations, the cruel sight could damage the vines. And that had happened even before he infused the dark mirror enchantment with divine flame. Yes, Sunny couldn't burn the ship itself, but that didn't mean that he couldn't deliver one surgical, immolating strike to the main body of the monster. The bastard was weak to fire, so the result would probably be nothing short of spectacular. The problem was, would the fire keepers be able to keep the monster preoccupied long enough for Sunny to achieve his objective? He looked at them gravely, and asked. Why are you all so sure that I can kill that thing? One of the fire keepers shrugged. You were in Lady Changing Star's cohort, were you not? She wouldn't trust just anybody to have her back. If she trusted in you, then so do we. No one weak survived the Forgotten Shore, anyway. Sunny barely suppressed a laugh. Wouldn't trust just anybody to have her back. Oh, the irony. He almost wanted to tell them about how Neph made the person literally sent into the dream realm to kill her the second in command. But of course, he did not. Yes, I suppose I was in her cohort. Another fire keeper smiled. Plus, Cassie thinks that you'll be able to do it. She is rarely wrong, you know. Do I ever? Sunny scowled. She wasn't wrong this time, however. In fact, her plan to deal with the thing that dwelled in the wreck was simple, but ingenious. Mostly because it relied on the only awakened capable of delivering a fatal blow to such a creature. Him. Without Sunny, it would have been really impossible. What a fortunate thing, that he needed her help with something else. He thought for a bit, and finally asked. Are you guys certain that you can survive drawing the monster's attention? Even after everything I told you? The young man who Cassie described as an awakened carpenter, Kair, chuckled. Pretty certain. As much as one can be certain about anything in the dream realm, I guess. All of us survived the siege, so we're aware of what we are signing up for. We have a good combination of aspects and know how to work together. We even have a healer, which should help against the poison. Point is, we are as ready as we ever going to be. Sunny stared at him for a while, then looked down at the map, and sighed. Alright, then. Let's kill a corrupted monster, Noel.n. Chapter 515 Traveling Together. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. The next day, Sunny left the sanctuary in the company of the fire keepers. Traveling across the chained aisles with Cassie and her cohort proved to be somewhat inconvenient. After all, they couldn't all turn into shadows and swiftly glide across heavenly chains as he could, but also a much more safe and pleasant experience than he was used to. In fact, this was probably the most relaxed and serene journey Sunny had ever undertaken in the dream realm. Even if the party moved slower, it was also much more battle-ready and capable than any solitary awakened could ever dream to be. Each of the fire keepers was a talented fighter with years of experience under their belt, and more than that, they fought together like a singular, finely tuned battle machine. Even though Sunny didn't want to admit it, he had to give Cassie credit. Under her leadership, the cohort had become a beautifully cohesive battle unit in less than a year. She must have learned well from how Nephis had built her cohort, and then her army, back in the Dark City. The fact that these young men and women shared a common past and had gone through a harrowing hell together must have helped a lot, too. Whenever the party encountered nightmare creatures, Sunny felt a very strange and unfamiliar sensation. It was almost as if he didn't have to do anything. He could literally remain still, and nothing would happen to him. His temporary companions were more than capable of dealing with the abominations themselves. Of course, that was only because the route they were taking had been carefully chosen to avoid the really dangerous places. There was another reason for why this expedition was going so smoothly. Cassie herself. Traveling with a powerful oracle was a very convenient thing, indeed. Not only was she able to steer the cohort clear of anything they were not equipped to deal with, she also had a supernatural intuition when it came to predicting which islands were going to enter into a descent, and which were going to rise instead. Thanks to that, they were able to avoid being caught by the crushing and having to either endure it or scramble to escape to the nearest isle, which could have landed them into the hunting territory of extremely powerful nightmare creatures. Just like before, Sunny and she worked together to make sure that nothing unexpected happened. With Cassie's intuition and his shadows scouting ahead, the cohort always had plenty of time to avoid a confrontation with dangerous abominations or thoroughly prepare for it. That it was almost like the good old times. The fact that Sunny, unlike the fire keepers, who had spent most of their time on the chained isles up north, knew this part of the region pretty well also helped. On the way, they had passed through many islands that he had explored and hunted on before. Plus, he had the covetous coffer now, which made their rest stops and meals much more enjoyable. So, as far as traversing the dream realm went, this journey was almost enjoyable. After a calm and comparatively uneventful week, they finally reached the shipwreck island. This close to the tier, the nightmare creatures were much more dangerous and vile. Sunny and the fire keepers were currently on the island he had visited before, the one with dozens of stone towers laying in ruins, overgrown by moss, and monstrous worms hiding underground. They had just fought off a swarm of them, and were now approaching the edge of the isle. Soon, the sight of the gargantuan chain stretching into the distance opened to them, and they heard the sound of rusty metal scraping against ancient iron on the wind. After a while, one of them said, "That wound in his chest, what kind of force could have shattered such a creature? And his arm, we saw it already, didn't we?" Sonny didn't respond, since the question wasn't directed at him, and thus his floor remained silent. Another fire keeper lingered, then asked in a curious tone. Maybe we should climb down and investigate, after taking control of the island. Sonny glanced at her, then shook her head. I wouldn't recommend that. The young woman raised an eyebrow. Why? A dark smile found its way onto his face. You think the monster in the wreck is bad? The being that dwells on the dark side of the island is much, much worse. Believe me. And that giant is well within its reach. In fact, I think that it uses him as bait to feed on the chain worms. Those are fallen demons, by the way, and of a very nasty variety. They're just candy to that thing, though. The fire keepers turned their attention to the underside of the shipwreck island, which was shrouded in darkness. Their faces turned solemn, and after a while, one of them asked. But what is it? Sonny shrugged. I have no idea. I only saw the tip of its root. That is why I am still alive. Most likely, if I saw the whole thing, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. After that, everyone remained silent. Sonny used that time to take another look at the two tall pillars that rose into the sky from the ancient stone structure on the other end of the chain. Now that he knew that the ancient ship had been a flying one, the purpose of these pillars became clear, too. They were wharves, or rather, mooring masts. The flying ship had to dock to something, after all, when it was not braving the vast expanse of the sky. That made him think. There were several such pillars on the island, which suggested that Noctis had not been the only one in possession of a sky vessel in the ancient past. Maybe flying ships were how all the inhabitants of the Chained Isles traveled across the chasms of the sky below. That made sense, really. The chains themselves were not exactly convenient roads, it's just that the Awakened used them for that purpose. But how had the captains of the flying ships dealt with the crushing? Or had there been no such curse on the Chained Isles before Hope escaped from its bonds? His thoughts were interrupted by the loud rattling of the heavenly chain. The shipwreck island was descending. The fire keepers looked at each other. Their faces turned grim. Cassie gripped the hilt of the quiet dancer, and then said, her voice calm and steady. Get ready. You all know the plan, so I won't waste time repeating it. Stay strong, stay together, and stay alive. Today, we will be victorious. Sonny stretched his neck, then summoned the cruel sight. Let's hope your intuition is right this time, too. Chapter 516 Legacy of Ruin. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Returning to the shipwreck island felt strange. It was almost exactly the same, but also different. They followed the remains of the ancient road and crested the hill to see the desolate valley below. The wreck of the once graceful ship was at its center, the dead tree wrapped around its mast. Thick vines were growing out of the breaches in its hull and spreading outward, some laying on the ground, some buried beneath it. Here and there, piles of wooden debris could be seen. Those were the sailor dolls, which had yet to assume their humanoid form after shape-shifting to withstand the crushing. What had changed, however, was that there was no chain on the other side of the valley anymore. The twisted rock had been destroyed and crumbled into the sky below, and now, the shipwreck island directly bordered the tier. Sonny felt as if the air itself was slightly different as the result. He gestured at the wooden debris and said, "Those are the sailor dolls. In a few minutes, they will assume their usual form, and after one notices us, the others will know of our presence, too. They'll swarm you pretty fast." The fire keepers had already summoned their weapons and were prepared for a fight. The faces were calm, cold concentration burning in their eyes. Cassie nodded. "This is it, then. We will see you on the other side." Sonny hesitated for a moment, then glanced at the members of the cohort. Out of habit, he had wanted to tell her to be careful, but then remembered who she was, and who he was, what they had been through together, and how it all ended. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Give them hell." The fire keepers smiled. One of them laughed. I'm pretty sure that this place is already enough of a hell. You stay safe too, Sunny. He sighed, then took a step back and disappeared into the shadows. Safely hidden in their dark embrace, Sunny observed as the fire keepers moved forward in a flexible battle formation. A few seconds later, he followed behind them unseen. Soon, the piles of debris shuddered and started assembling into tall, menacing wooden humanoids, their arms ending with jagged blades. The fire keepers did not wait for the first one to lunge at them, and launched an attack themselves. Shakti, the former artisan with an aspect revolving around plants, drew a heavy bow, and sent an arrow flying. It hit the nearest abomination in the head and suddenly exploded into shards, creating a cloud of icy mist. The creature swayed, then turned to face them, one side of its body in shambles. As it moved toward the humans, a thin crust of ice formed on its limbs, slowing the doll down. Before it could strike with its blades, another fire keeper dashed forward and brought the blade of a heavy axe on its shoulder, severing one of the abomination's arms completely. Another appeared by his side, receiving a retaliatory strike on his shield. The young man grunted, but held his ground. A moment later, the sailor doll was dead, hacked into pieces by the rest of the cohort. Not a bad start. But that was just the beginning. Soon, the 8 humans were surrounded by a dozen more fallen beasts, all towering above them with menacing, bloodthirsty determination. Things were about to turn bad for the fire keepers, but at that moment, Kair, the artisan specializing in carpentry, froze for a moment and narrowed his eyes. Immediately, a subtle change happened to the wooden creatures. While not really rendered weak, they did, however, become a bit sluggish and slow. That made it possible for the members of the cohort to hold against the onslaught of the nightmare creatures a whole rank above their own. It was not easy, though. The fire keepers held their formation, but only just barely. The young man armed with the heavy axe was now using his aspect ability, which made the blade of his weapon shine with an angry red glow. It bit into the wooden flesh of the abomination he was fighting, penetrating much deeper than it should have been able to. His partner was like a wall, refusing to take even a step back. He blocked strike after strike with his heavy shield, lashing out from behind it with a short spear from time to time to keep the enemies from simply overwhelming him with their size and mass. This was the healer of the cohort, so his fortitude and grit came from his physical prowess alone, not from any kind of ability. There was another fire keeper that used a shield, a young woman with dirty blonde hair and an aspect that allowed her to exert vicious strength with each strike of her sword. She fought in tandem with a young man who wielded 2 great swords, in his 4 hands. The second pair appeared when he activated his own aspect ability. These two were quite devastating together. Shakti continued to fire her bow, switching between memory arrows and mundane ones, which were crafted by Kair. Her bow was powerful enough, and her aim precise enough, to deal heavy damage to the advancing sailor dolls. The carpenter himself was sustaining the strange hex he put on the abominations and covering her with a wooden staff in his hands, his face grim and full of resolve. Another fire keeper possessed an aspect that allowed him to gift his companions with an augmentation to stamina and endurance, as well as making one of them much more resilient. He wielded a curved sword and covering Cassie's back. And then, there was Cassie herself, who had turned out to be perhaps the most deadly of them all. She wielded the quiet dancer in one hand and a long dagger in the other, using it to deflect blows and launch an unexpected, quick attack from time to time. The delicate girl wasn't the strongest, nor was she the fastest of the fire keepers. However, she fought with confident grace and deadly insight resembling that of a true master. If it was anybody else, Sunny would have assumed that they had long reached the pinnacle of skill and were now able to not only flawlessly follow, but also control the flow of battle. It reminded him of how Nephi's fought, of how deeply attuned she was to the underlying laws that govern combat. Of course, the difference was that while Changing Star was able to predict and manipulate the cadence of battle due to her knowledge, talent, and skill, Cassie could actually perceive a few moments into the future, which made her a frightening presence on the battlefield. As Sunny watched, a towering sailor doll raised one of its blades and brought it down on the blind girl, aiming to cut her body in half. However, Cassie simply moved slightly to the side a split second before the blade would have sliced her apart, and lashed out with her dagger. At the same time, the quiet dancer suddenly flew out of her hand and shot through the air. The dagger pierced the creature's chest, while the rapier threw its second blade a few centimeters of course, then continued forward and tore through another abomination's neck. In the span of a second, 2 fallen beasts were heavily wounded, and soon fell dead to the ground. Still, Sunny recognized the truth of it behind the superficial appearance. Yes, Cassie had an incredible advantage due to her unique and powerful aspect. But not just anyone would have been able to make use of it. In fact, almost no one could have done what she did. In the havoc of a battle, especially a battle between awakened and nightmare creatures, where a fraction of a second could mean the difference between life and death, it was already immensely hard to perceive, comprehend, and react to the enemy's actions in time. It must have been so much harder, then, to perceive both the present and the future, to comprehend not one but 2 states of the battle, and swiftly act in response to achieve the result, not to mention that Cassie was doing all that while being blind. The mental strain and burden of it all. Sunny couldn't even imagine it. What he did know, however, was that it was impossible to perform such a feat without one crucial thing. Clarity. It seemed that Cassie had not listened to the lessons Nephi's had taught them for nothing. She was Changing Star's other pupil, after all. Soon, the Fire Keepers had dealt with the first wave of the sailor dolls. But the second, larger one was already approaching. Before it could reach them, though, Cassie grabbed the quiet dancer from the air, turned to her cohort, and yelled. "Prepare." Then, she covered her mouth and nose with a hand, turned the rapier down, and thrust it deep into the earth. A moment later, the ground shook. Chapter 517 Baiting the Monster. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Suddenly, the whole of the valley seemed to be moving. The ground shook and seethed, and slowly, green and brown vines started rising from beneath it like vile snakes. The hulking sailor dolls that were about to descend upon the Fire Keepers froze, as if consumed by fear. Then, they turned around and stumbled away. Some simply crumbled into piles of debris, pretending to be dead. Even these fallen beasts were terrified of the being that dwelled in the heart of the ancient wreck. Cassie and her cohort, however, remained unperturbed. Moving with swift determination, they made their preparations. Just a moment after the blind oracle thrust her rapier into the ground, the Fire Keepers had strips of cloth wrapped around their mouths and noses. The corpses of the slain sailor dolls were dragged to form a circle around them and set aflame. Soon, the cohort was surrounded by a ring of tall bonfires, the 8 awakened bathed in the waves of heat. They stood back to back, their weapons drawn and their faces full of grim resolve. Only Shakti was on one knee, her hand pressed to the ground. After a moment, she screamed something. Sunny was still observing from the shadows, his emotions in turmoil. Although he would no go so far as to call these young people friends, he had grown somewhat attached to them after going through the ordeal of the civil war in the Bright Castle and traveling together. These Fire Keepers were a likable sort. He didn't want to watch them die while doing nothing. But that was his role in this fight. He had to remain safely hidden until the corrupted monster's attention was fully concentrated on Cassie's cohort, and then deliver one decisive strike, ending it all. That time had not come yet. Consumed by dark discontent, Sunny continued to watch. Reacting to Shakti's scream, one of the Fire Keepers suddenly dashed to the side. A fraction of a second later, the moss beneath his feet was pierced by a stem of a brown vine. It thrashed blindly, failing to catch anyone in its deadly embrace, but then seemed to have sensed the presence of life, and shot toward the nearest human. The vine was as thick as a man's arm, and there were black thorns protruding from its glistening surface. One of the Fire Keepers sliced at it with her sword, but the sharp blade just bounced off of the vine without leaving even a scratch on its surface. 2 others simply fell on it, pressing the thing down with their shields. That gave enough time for the young man whose aspect allowed him to enhance his weapon-type memories to bring his glowing axe down, severing the vine. As soon as he did, a cloud of poisonous mist shot out from the cut, enveloping the young man. Luckily, he knew to hold his breath and immediately jumped back. Cassie, who had sheathed her rapier and was now holding a familiar wooden staff, pointed it forward and summoned the wind. The cloud of poison was blown toward the bonfires and devoured by flame. That axe is an ascended memory. Indeed, it was. In fact, all of the fire keepers seemed to be equipped rather well, and several of them wielded weapons above their rank. Quiet Dancer was also not the only echo in their possession. Just as another vine appeared from the flames, its stem singed and damaged, a familiar shape suddenly weaved itself from sparks of light just beyond the ring of bonfires and pounced on it. It was a creature that looked like a giant praying mantis, its flesh composed of glass and blood-red clay. Sunny remembered seeing these creatures during the siege of the Crimson Spire. 2 scythes came down on the vine, and bit deep into it. A moment later, the mantis dashed away with incredible speed, avoiding being entangled and shredded to pieces by the jagged black thorns. Despite this efficient start, more and more vines were crawling toward the circle of fire, and several more appeared from beneath the ground inside it. With each moment that passed, the size of the vines attacking the fire keepers was bound to increase, too. The further from the wreck, the thinner and weaker the vines were. But closer to the ancient ship, truly monstrous ones were already in motion, spreading outward with murderous intent. It was as though the monster was slowly unfurling its long limbs, which both spelled doom for the cohort of awakened and was their intent. Only when the primary vines were too far away from the main body of the creature to return at once could Sunny make his move. After that, he was either going to succeed and end the whole battle, preventing the fire keepers from perishing in the flood of vines, or they were all going to die together. That moment of truth was swiftly approaching. Faced with more and more vines, Cassie and her cohort did their best to resist. They cut apart those that were damaged by the fire enough for their weapons to become effective, and concentrated the efforts of several members on those which did not. But no matter how hard they fought, soon, the scales started to tilt in the favor of the corrupted monster. Their formation was on the verge of being broken, and their actions, perfectly coordinated at first, were slowly turning desperate and hectic. Despite its terrifying speed, the echo of the blood-red mantis was finally caught by the vines. Its glass body was immediately shredded, and the creature was only saved from being completely destroyed by the swift reaction of its master, who dismissed it just in time. That was the moment when the primary vines finally reached the ring of bonfires. Sunny threw one last glance at the desperately fighting fire keepers. His gaze lingered on Cassie, who wielded her long dagger at the head of the cohort, for a few moments. Then, he turned away and stepped through the shadows. A second later, Sunny emerged from the gloomy shadow on the hull of the ancient ship, far away from the mayhem of battle. And very close to the terrifying creature that was the source of all that horror. Summoning the cruel sight, Sunny held his breath, and jumped into the darkness, nesting in a jagged breach in the hull. It was time for him to play his role. Chapter 518 Cargo Hold. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Landing into the poisonous miasma of the ancient wreck, Sunny immediately turned into a shadow and glided over the ancient wooden boards, which were long ago overgrown with brown moss and bulging, thorned vines. To be honest, he would have preferred to move through the ship as a human. Sunny knew that he was going to inhale at least some of the poison while fighting the being that dwelled in the cargo hold, so having some time to get accustomed to the debilitating effect of the toxin was better than going through that process in the middle of the battle. But he couldn't risk getting noticed too soon. The whole battle was supposed to be over in just a few moments, anyway. Alas, Sunny had little hope that everything was going to go as planned. His previous experiences had taught him that very few things ever did. Remembering the path he had taken during the hunt for Noctis coins, Sunny glided through the narrow corridors. This time, they were vastly different from how they had been before. After all, the monster was wide awake now. The vines sprawling through the ancient wreck were pulsating, moving, spouting clouds of deadly mist. The air was murky and full of disturbing sounds of something slithering beyond the wooden bulkheads. It was as though Sunny was inside a giant, living organism. A virus cell that invaded the ancient wreck to kill its host. Luckily, these were mostly just the roots of the vile vines. The parts that were really mobile and dangerous were far away, currently killing the cohort of fire keepers. Suddenly grim, Sunny increased his speed, and soon reached the gates of the cargo hold, which were bent outward, as if straining to contain something pressing on them from the other side. He could feel the vast space beyond the gate, and a massive shadow of the creature in its center, its form rhythmically expanding and contracting, as if breathing. With each contraction, a wave of warm wind blew through the remnants of the flying ship. He lingered for a fraction of a second, and then gathered his resolve. There was no time to waste. Spending a small fraction of his essence to step through the shadows once more, Sunny appeared in the cargo hold, and froze, slightly stunned by the terrible visage of the corrupted monster. What the hell, is that? The cargo hold was very large, and filled almost entirely with thick, brown vines that snaked outward and disappeared in the breaches in the ancient wood. They all originated from a single source, a vast, pulsating mass of moss in its center. In the very heart of the mass, however, there was a shape of a human, their body twisted in a terrible convulsion. Sunny couldn't tell if the human was a man or a woman, alive or dead, but he was sure of one thing: the vines sprawling through the entire island all came from within the flesh of that creature. They grew from the mouth of the abhorrent corpse, from their ears, piercing their chest and abdomen, snaking from beneath the skin of their arms and legs. The sight of it was both terrifying and repulsive, but most of all, it was ghoulishly wrong. It was as though the vines had once exploded from the body of the ancient human, killing them, but also somehow keeping them alive and breathing. And as long as the human breathed, the vines would continue to exist and grow, too, slowly absorbing the ancient ship, the valley beyond, all of the shipwreck island, and then, one day, who knew? That is the thing I need to kill. Sunny had seen many horrors in his life, and killed his fair share of them, but no matter how experienced and powerful he became, there were things that humans were just not meant to be able to behold calmly. Staring at the ghastly being trapped in the cargo hold of the flying ship, Sunny didn't lose his composure or resolve, but he couldn't help but feel a deep, cold sense of fear. Fear, however, was a welcomed guest. Fear told him that he was still sane, and had some measure of humanity left in his soul. As long as Sunny did not surrender to fear, it was all right to feel it from time to time. One strike, get close, exit the shadows, and thrust the cruel sight into its chest. The divine flame is going to do the rest. Steeling himself, he began to glide forward, trying to traverse the vast cargo hold as quickly as possible. The plan, however, went wrong just a moment later. Because as soon as Sunny moved, and long before he was able to get anywhere near the terrible creature, the corpse suddenly opened its eyes. Those eyes were empty, dead, and as dark as the abyss of the sky below. And they were staring directly at him, as if the creature could easily pierce the veil of darkness and separate the intruding shadow from all the rest. Sunny was caught. No way. He froze for a fraction of a second, stunned by the fact that the incredible stealth augmentation of his aspect was broken with such ease. And then, all hell broke loose. Sunny's first thought was to retreat and run as fast as he could. After all, he was currently a shadow, and as far as he knew, thorny vines and poison were not capable of harming a shadow. But if he did so, the fire keepers were going to die. And more than that, he was determined to kill this thing. He wanted its shadow fragments, its memory, if there were to be one, and its secrets. The terrible creature had to die for his plans to go smoothly, for his challenge of the second nightmare to have as high a chance of success as possible. So, he didn't run. Instead, Sunny dashed forward, flying toward the pulsating mass of brown moss and vines with as much speed as he could muster. It was only going to take him a second to reach the ghastly corpse, as long as simply stepping through the shadows would. However, the host of the ancient wreck did not remain idle. Countless vines sprawling on the floor and the walls of the cargo hold suddenly surged, spewing clouds of poison, and more emerged from the mangled flesh of the ancient being. These vines, however, did not shoot at Sunny in a futile attempt to catch a shadow. Instead, they flew upward, tearing the hull of the ship apart. Bright sunlight flooded through the wide breach, and as it banished the shadows populating the cargo hold, Sunny was suddenly expelled from their safe embrace, rolling on the floor while the sharp thorns of the vines bit into his flesh through the fabric of the puppeteer's shroud. His thoughts were in a state of momentary panic. Not good. Chapter 519 Trapped. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sunny rolled over his shoulder and jumped to his feet, the blade of the cruel sight slicing through a vine that was flying through the air to ensnare him. Blood was streaming down his back, and poison was entering his lungs. What's worse, a concentrated dose of it must have been infused into his bloodstream by the black thorns. Sunny suddenly felt feverish and weak, and a sense of cold paralysis was spreading through the left side of his body, which took the most damage. He was still able to move, and Blood Weave was already working to contain and devour the toxin. But before it prevailed, Sunny was in a dire situation. Gritting his teeth, he dashed to the side, hoping to escape the sunlight and use Shadow Step to reach the abominable creature in the center of the cargo hold. Before he could dive into the saving darkness of the shadows, however, a massive vine crushed into the floorboards, shattering them and barring his way. Sunny froze for a fraction of a second, realizing that there was nowhere to escape. Dozens of vines were already moving in his direction, glistening in the sunlight as clouds of murky mist escaped from the pores on their surface. Even though the root section of the vines was not very mobile, the sheer amount of them made it almost impossible to survive the onslaught. What's worse, the vines were contracting, pulling more and more of their length into the cargo hold. He cursed that at least the pressure on the fire keepers should have diminished. Sunny, however. Sunny was one moment away from being killed. He was not going to be able to reach the monster without the help of the shadows, but bathed in the merciless sunlight, he also had no chance of diving into their embrace. All he could do was use his own. Commanding one of the shadows to unwrap itself from his body, Sunny sent it toward the ghastly corpse and staggered as the strength and resilience provided by it disappeared. The second shadow slid from the cruel sight and attached itself to his feet, meant to serve as a threshold through which he was going to step. Now, all he had to do was to survive the short second it was going to take the first shadow to reach its goal. That was easier said than done. Straining the flexibility of his body to its limit, Sunny felt his joint groan and his tendons tremble on the verge of tearing apart. Twisting at an almost impossible angle, he dodged one of the vines, placed his hand on the spongy carpet of the brown moss, and performed a bizarre spin, narrowly sliding between two more. If not for the torturous training he had put himself through to accommodate the inhuman demands of shadow dance, this would have been impossible. Feeling the skin of his palm burn, as though submerged in stomach acid, he retrieved his hand from the brown moss and immediately jumped backward to save himself from being entangled in the slithering vines. He was swift enough to avoid being caught, but not swift enough to escape unscathed. The black thorns tore into his right side, and more blood flowed down his body, while more poison entered his bloodstream. Arg! Sunny ducked, dashed desperately to the side, then rolled and threw himself upward from an impossible position, feeling his ligaments rip. Dodging the swarm of vines was like being a fly surrounded by a contracting mass of spiderwebs. Luckily, he only had to survive in their lethal, moving maze for a second. Before the vines could turn into an impenetrable barrier all around him, Sunny dove into his shadow and emerged right in front of the vile mass of brown moss, and the remains of the human encased within it. The cruel sight flashed with pure light, and in one fluid motion, he thrust its incandescent blade into the chest of the monster. Got you. And then. Nothing happened. The corpse didn't react to receiving a mortal wound at all. Its ghastly face remained unmoving, its eyes full of terrifying emptiness, its body a harrowing mess of torn flesh and slithering brown vines. The mass of moss continued to contract and expand, and the vines themselves continued to pursue the invader. Even the divine flame seemed to have no effect on the corrupted monster. Sunny paled. Crap, he twisted the cruel sight, hoping that it would have some effect, but all was in vain. The corrupted monster simply refused to die, for whatever reason, and the ancient remains that were its source appeared to be immune to flame, even if the vines themselves were susceptible to it. The information Cassie shared with him came from Master Roan, who had fought the vines once. But he had never entered the wreck, so of course, the dashing griffin rider couldn't have known that the creature itself did not share the weaknesses of its sprawling thorned limbs. Damn! Now what? The vines were already upon him. Before they could ensnare Sunny, though, 2 ruby eyes ignited in his shadow, and a graceful figure of the demonic knight lunged forward out of it. The blade of her stone-like sword flashed through the air, easily severing several vines, and then her shield crashed into the slithering vernicose wall, pushing it away and making the whole cargo hold shudder. Now that saint was ascended, and augmented by one of his shadows, her strength was truly frightening. The taciturn demon spun in the mass of vines, cutting them down like a demented gardener. For a moment, none of them could reach her. Sunny wrapped the second shadow around himself and retrieved the cruel sight, thinking feverishly. What the hell, how do I kill this thing? He could try to place the broken oath near it and retreat, but no, that wouldn't work. Unlike the mordant mimic, who had been paralyzed by the crushing, the being trapped in the cargo hold of the ancient ship could simply move the charm away with one of its vines, or crush it. And if Sunny tried to prevent it from doing so, he would succumb to the soul damage first. Even with the help of the mantle of the underworld, he would still be just an awakened, a corrupted monster's soul was much, much more vast and resilient. Leaving Saint to fend for herself was also not an option, since even with her newfound might, she had no chance of surviving in a battle against this powerful creature alone. Not all corrupted monsters were created equal, and the 2 of them had the misfortune of stumbling on an especially dreadful one. So, what else was there? Sunny couldn't damage the abhorrent abomination itself, but he could damage the vines. That would buy him some time to come up with a solution, at least. Jumping back, he sliced at the root of a thick vine growing out of the ancient human's forearm, severing it. As a side effect of this attack, the corpse seemed to retrieve some control of its hand, which slowly rose and stretched toward Sunny. Damn! Suddenly feeling a sickening, cold sensation in his heart, he hurried to create as much distance between himself and the corpse as he could. However, the abomination didn't seem to be launching an attack. Its hand strained to rise, held down by the mass of vines growing from it. Struggling against this terrible burden, it twitched and moved slightly, then froze. One of its fingers trembled. The creature seemed to be pointing at something. And for the first time, the expression in its empty eyes changed, betraying that there was still a hint of consciousness trapped in this mangled body. Those terrible eyes were not burning with bloodlust, hunger, or wrath. Instead, they were full of harrowing agony and pleading. Chapter 520 Deliverance. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Sunny almost stumbled because of the terrible realization. Was the mutilated body inside the nest of moss still alive? How could that be? Thousands of years must have passed since the flying ship crashed on this desolate island. How long had this poor soul suffered this harrowing torture? What sin had they committed, and who had doomed them for an eternity of ghastly suffering? How had the vines ended up growing from their flesh, and why? But most importantly, how the hell was that mangled thing not dead? Even divine flame was powerless to end its grisly, gruesome existence. If Sunny could find the answer, maybe he would be able to kill the corrupted monster, after all. Using the momentary lull in the onslaught of the vines that Saint's appearance had bought him, he faced away from the fight and tried to understand what the host of the abominable growth was pointing at. He desperately hoped that the ancient human was, indeed, trying to point at something, and not just convulsing in terrible pain. Where is it? What is it? His gaze flew to a certain point on the wall of the cargo hold and lingered on it. At first glance, there was nothing different about it. That section of the bulkhead was just like all the rest, ancient and overgrown with brown moss. But as he looked closer, he noticed a small gap in the layer of moss, as well as a strange bend to the vines growing on that particular wall. It was as though they, too, wanted to avoid something lodged into the wooden boards. That had to be it. However, Sonny didn't see anything in the small circular gap, just a splinter of wood sticking out of it at a sharp angle. His heart was beating like a wild beast in a cage, consumed equally by hope and despair. Throwing a glance at Saint, who was slowly drowning in the flood of slithering vines, he hesitated for a moment, and then rushed toward the wall instead of joining her in the fight. There has to be something, there has to be. He was certain that the ancient human pointed at that section of the wall for a reason. Or rather, he hoped that they had. Jumping over an attacking vine and staggering sideways to avoid another one, Sonny slashed, hacked, and tore his way through the cargo hold, feeling more wounds appearing on his body and more poison flowing through his bloodstream. At this point, even Bloodweave was having trouble resisting the deadly toxin. Well, it was miraculous enough that he could withstand it at all, considering that the poison came from a creature 2 whole ranks above Sonny. Weaver's lineage was, indeed, a terrifying thing. Maybe there was a reason for why it was described as forbidden. Finally, Sonny sliced through the last vine in his way, leaving it broken and singed, and crashed into the overgrown bulkhead near the small gap in the brown moss. Drawing in a hoarse breath, he stared at it with enough intensity to melt stones. Wait, is it? His eyes widened slightly. The thing that he had thought to be a splinter turned out to be something else. Out there on the wall of the cargo hold, thrust deeply into it by someone's hand, was a rather simple dot-looking knife. Its shape, however, was very familiar to Sonny. It was exactly the same as the knife that lay on the white altar of the sanctuary of Noctis, except for the fact that this one wasn't cut from a single piece of obsidian. However, it also wasn't cut from ivory. Instead, it seemed to be made entirely of wood, as if a tree branch had somehow grown in the shape of a knife, and was then broken off to become one. What does it mean? Sonny allowed himself to remain confused and perplexed for a split second, and then decisively grabbed the handle of the knife. Act now, think later. Damn it all. Please don't tell me that I need 1,000 coins to lift this one, too. Luckily, this time, there was no need for an offering. Although it took some effort, a moment later, the wooden blade slid from where it was thrust into the wall, and Sonny found himself holding the cruel sight in one hand, and the strange wooden knife in the other. Something else happened, though. As soon as he laid his hands on the wooden handle, all the vines in the cargo hold surged in his direction with frenzied fury, utterly forgetting about Saint and her vicious sword. Sonny paled. Crap. Before the mass of slithering vines could crush him, he abandoned all attempts to escape and thrust his hand forward instead. The wooden knife slipped from his grip, cut a sharp arc in the air, and was nimbly caught by Saint. Without wasting the opportunity that the sudden shift in the corrupted monster's behavior gave her, the taciturn demon immediately dashed toward the pulsating mass of brown moss, and thrust the wooden knife right into one of the ancient human's empty eyes. In the next moment, the whole wreck shuddered. The mass of moss violently contracted, throwing Saint away. The vines suddenly lost any semblance of cohesion and thrashed violently, forcing Sonny to retreat as close to the wall as he could. Still, the sea of black thorns was mere centimeters away from his face, raging in a storm of chaotic movements. Even the brown moss he was pressed against seemed to be convulsing, as if overwhelmed by unbearable pain. Despite all that, the only thing Sonny saw was the one remaining eyes of the terribly malformed ancient human. It stared at him for a few moments, the emptiness and darkness slowly giving way to something else. A feeling of relief so vast that it was almost beyond the concept of emotion. Then, that look of deliverance was gone, too. The terrible eye was empty once again, now truly and forever. The head of the ancient human lifelessly rolled back. And as soon as it did, the vine suddenly fell to the ground, too, dead and motionless. Suddenly weak, Sonny powerlessly slid to the floor. The voice of the spell whispered into his ear. You have slain a corrupted monster, Wormvine. You have slain a transcendent human, Solvane. Your shadow grows stronger.